because there's a principle in law, nemo dat quod non habet. You can't give what you don't have. Someone who has come to power undemocratically cannot be expected then to produce democracy. So the challenge now is to come from that abnormal situation and somehow miraculously for him to find it within himself to do what a Rawlings did to us. And that's when you can then find a Kenyan example where you have presidential aspirants debate before the people and then you choose. But here, you know, in our situation, it's criminal to even have aspirations to that position, and that really is the root of the problem.
And just listening to you, I mean, from my perspective, what I feel is that we do not have a democracy in this country. What we have is actually a charade. We don't. And that is very scary. Yes. And we should be scared. And indeed, and it's important for us to be scared, because that is the beginning then for a national conversation where we realize what we are dealing with. Because you see, for a long time, I think we have been in a state of slumber. That we have the appearance of democracy, we have elections, we have periodic elections, which are really shams. And I'll give you one specific example to demonstrate the sham democracy that we have. In 1996, we had what appeared to be democratic elections. We went through the motions, the ballot papers, etc. There were contestants. In 2007, the president told the Povluero, and this is on record, that if you had elected Makerere, I would have gone to the bush. What did you expect us to do? So, in essence, you had a process where there was an electoral commission, there were people lining up and vote, but those votes meant nothing, in the sense that if there had been if a wrong result had been returned, nothing would have changed. You know, and for me, that's the danger that we face now. I think we as a country would like to have a national discussion, like you say.
Yes.
But how do you have a national discussion when there are issues with freedom of expression?
And you see, and that space will keep getting closed and closed and closed. And for me, it calls to mind Pastor Niemöller's statement in the Nazi Germany. Okay. That first they came for the Jews, they kept quiet, I wasn't a Jew, they came for the Catholics. So as Ugandans were seeing the space being closed, but we somehow sit back and say, well, it's those people. So it happens with the Public Order Management Act. So this is to deal with the messages who are, those you know, the rioters, they are spoiling business in town. We say, we're traders, we want to, you know, those people who are disturbing us. Then we say NGO Amendment Act. We say it's to deal with those for the NGOs. They're trying to make money from donors, etc. Then it comes to the people we don't like. You know, the homosexuals say, well, those people, it's un-African, etc. It's to deal with them. Then when it comes to us, there's no space left, because now it comes to bail, you know, an amendment, bail amendment. Then it comes to other restrictions on civil freedoms. But since we have seen this happen gradually and not spoken out, I fear that as Ugandans we're going towards complete tyranny. And because we haven't woken up to it completely and said, speak for even those we don't like, by the time it comes to us, there will be no one left to speak for us.
But how many people can actually speak for us? Because all of us obviously can't speak.
Yes.
Who can actually speak for us? Who should speak for us?
In some sense, I have some hope, in a sense, because there's a certain resilience in the population. That at some point, I think there's a certain residual resilience in the population, at which point people say, well, maybe this is enough is enough. And I think you see it in the daily struggles of Ugandans. You also see it, in a sense, in tax avoidance and tax evasion. For me, I'm beginning to think of these sort of silent protests. You find people not going to the bank, not declaring income, not declaring taxes, and this is one of the signs of people saying, we don't trust the state, we shall not give you our money. People normally have no problem paying taxes because they see where the money goes. But if they pay taxes and see purchase
the health sector is failing,
precisely, that there's no state, there's no present state except in the coercive sense, that you only see the state in tear gas form. That's why someone called Afande Kaihura Afande tear gas today. Yes. That you meet the state in its coercive apparatus. That's a problem. So people protest silently. They withdraw from the state. And you see this then in URA now going to try to catch the informal sector. And for me, that's where the protest is happening. And I think it will build.
Okay, let's look at something very specific. As the fault lines continue to emerge, the wife of Premier Mbabazi, Jacqueline Mbabazi, has called those who criticize the husband fascist, thugs, obsessed with the downfall of her husband. How did we get to this? In terms of a party, I mean, was it because there was no free spirit within the party? How did the party, this particular party, get to this state?
I think, unfortunately, in this particular case, it's a case of the chickens coming home to roost. Because with all due respect, Premier Mbabazi was the gentleman who told Busingye when he came up to contest that he was jumping the queue. In a democracy, there should be no queue. There
should be no queue. Precisely. Anyone should be free to just come up and run.
Precisely. So his suggestion that there was a queue An extra-legal coup was a suggestion that boded very terribly for our democracy. This was again the same gentleman who sold to Uganda a phone interception bill. So for me, I really see a trend of chicken coming home to roost. But at the same time, we should stand up and speak for Mbabazi precisely. Simply because he failed to speak for Busingye, that means we should not speak for him. Because in Mbabazi is our own interest. That if we stand by and see a party disrespect its own constitution, that leads us, it goes back to the point I was making, that simply because we may not agree with him, or he has done certain things in the past that we don't agree with, doesn't mean that we shouldn't recognize what's happening for what it is. And I agree with his wife when she says, when Hope Messenger says that, you know, this is fascism in a sense. Because you have a constitution that says you elect a leader at a particular forum.
Yeah.
And you do it extra that constitution, outside that constitution. That cannot be fair. Now, unfairness to Mbabazi will translate, and I see it in the sense of a broader unfairness to all of us, in the sense of the subversion of an a democratic process. But again, Rukshana, going back to what I was saying, is that this is not new. And actually, for it to happen otherwise would have been the surprise. That in essence, the project has always been the consolidation of power through military means. And anyone who thinks that they're going to take it through an election, as Mbabazi seems to think, I think is sadly mistaken.
Okay, obviously, like what you said, the problem is symptomatic even in opposition political parties.
Yeah.
So is it not just a question of people fearing internal competition? And maybe that's why some people are saying, okay, let the NRM guys sort themselves out internally. Yeah. So is it not just an issue of internal competition?
I think it's an issue of failure of a democratic process. I think you make a good point when you talk about it's a broader problem. It's not even about the individual, His Excellency or others around him. It's a systemic question. But it's also related, I think, to our tradition, a broader tradition or lack of tradition of democracy. That in the colonial times were ruled by law, through orders in council, through coercion. The Supreme Court decisions in respect of the previous election 2001, 2006 were actually almost word for word taken from previous colonial decisions, where the colonialists told us that this was an act of state, they can't inquire into it because there are certain doctrines of act of state. So there's a whole tradition where we have not really imbibed principles of democracy. So for me, it's not even an individual. It's not even about individuals. It's about a system. It's about a psyche among Ugandans. And even if you brought it home, even in the domestic setting, do we have a culture of democracy as Ugandans? And so, for me, I think even if you change the players, if you change the actors right now, you may not get
you may not necessarily get to where we have to get.
Even if Best just stood in the same seat now, you may even have something that's even worse. So the question goes back now to perhaps a democracy from below. And that's where it needs to start, democracy from below, from homes to villages. When you see mob justice on the street, then you cannot expect or ask anything better from the state if as individuals we're not willing to extend that sort of respect for human rights, rule of law from below. And I think that's what,
and that's going to take us eternity.
And it must, democracy is messy. And for it to be sustainable, it must be taken slowly. We must work at it. And for me, really, it's about the youth now, the 75%. And that's why for me, as a fellow youth myself, it's extremely saddening to see someone kneeling down and asking for more dictatorship, asking for more tyranny. For me, then, I see it as a betrayal, really, of our country, because this is the state where I'm supposed to be saying, look, some people have messed this country up, we should be taking back. But to see on Women's Day, a female youth leader basically subordinating herself.
But if you do not know better, you cannot ask for better.
But she should.
So maybe the youth actually don't know better.
And for me, that's the scary thing. She should know better. Really, really, she should know better.
Okay, and that basically winds up our conversation tonight, because our time is fast spent. That was Constitutional Law Don Busingye Kabumba joining us on Talk of the Nation to discuss whether Uganda is at a crossroads in the question of the rule of law. We'll take a short break and return shortly with NTV Weekend Sport.
Today in History is brought to you by